Yeah, I can go ahead and get started. I was posting all those questions in. So Allie, perhaps if you want to continue doing that, that would be awesome. And we're going to repeat all the questions to folks as well. So, you know, we can um, share screen and do all of that. But thank you all for joining us today. And this is the final lecture that we have for a couple of the folks within the YA network. And so today we're going to have, a roundtable discussion about sort of what's next when it comes to the network as a whole, when it comes to looking forward for COP26, and what students can do to continue to stay engaged within this network. And I'm going to be hosting for now with Allie, who is the fellow for SDG 9. These questions were put together by SDG 11 team, and that fellow is Elise Going, and she'll be joining us at about 1:30 Mountain Time. So if you hear someone new chime in at that time, that's the fellow that is put together all these questions with the assistance of their mentor, Sarah Hotzinger from Colorado College. So yeah, like I said, what's next for YA? We have an amazing group of PIs in this network. And as you can see, I mean, it's quite complicated, and it's grown even since this figure was put together for the original National Science Foundation grant. And so we have, all these amazing students from La Molina University, as well as their PI, Javier, joining this network. And, we have intent to grow, which is really exciting as well. And so we've invited, I think at this point, nearly everyone from the network, with the exception of our Indiana University, Monash University, and a Scripps representative, joining us today in lecture to answer some questions. And Allie and I are going to show you these questions, and we'd love to have students ask questions as well, just so we can get a nice closeout for this class and the conversation of what's next when it comes to international negotiations. And so I'm going to be kind of the slide guru, and Allie's going to be asking the questions. And for the PIs, I posted the order of what question we'd like folks to respond to. So I think Andrew was actually on one of those first couple questions, but when it's your time to speak, I'll toggle to your slide just so everyone has, a face to a name if your internet's spotty like Gillian and myself, and so you can't keep video on, as well as just, your background, and if you mentored a team or guest lectured a team, we all have access to that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allie, and she will ask the first question.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you all again for being here. We're really excited to begin today. So I'm just going to hop right into it. For this first question, I'm going to ask it to Andrew and Sarah H. So I think because Andrew's slide is up, we'll begin with him. And the question is, a major emphasis for YA is to give students international negotiation and collaboration skills. How do you see this happening, especially in this year's SDG teams and student conference?
Okay, Ellie, thank you. I'll try and keep it short. First of all, I think that, given the nature of the planet, where we are, where a lot of our politics is at the moment, I think there's never been a more important time to have international negotiation skills. There's never been a more important time for, the world to come together, and particularly young people to come together, because that sets the future for the planet and the direction of the planet. So I think that's very important. I've really liked the way that students have not come together or have not come together in their groups, either within their nationalities or within their universities, but they've come together into different groups. They've spoken to each other. They haven't just relied on the organisation that's taken place here, but they've reached out to each other through Slack and via email. And I think that that has been, you know, a real awakening for me, you know, as a tutor, and I can, you know, I can see ways that I can inform my students better about what it's going to be in future years and get more buy-in from the students. I'm hoping that within the conference that we get a large, you know, a large number of participants not only presenting but also listening, and so that we can have a, you know, a kind of global picture around the SDGs. The SDGs are, of course, global. They're naturally global. But if you're a student in a particular country and you haven't had much interaction with people from other countries, then this is a great opportunity to get together, to learn to respect other ideas and other countries, and other people and their opinions. So I'm really hoping that students take away from this, but I'm also really hoping that the students who work together on these SDG teams really keep in touch with each other, you know, and really continue to work with each other. You know, there's a fantastic team of mentors here, you know, and a really enthusiastic and actually a nice team to work with, and that makes a difference. And if we can keep that going and get continued buy-in from the students after they graduate, I think that will be very, very good. And hopefully someone will come and join us in Derby and in Glasgow for the COP next November. Is that okay?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Okay.
And we'll transition to Sarah H. for the same question. And please let me know if you need me to repeat it. It's also in the chat, I think a little earlier.
Sarah, you're muted.
Of course I'm muted. Thanks, everyone. One of the things that occurs to me in terms of international collaboration in particular has been watching the different groups of students from different universities join at different times. And, you know, my class, we're on a very different format where an entire class lasts for just 1 month, and they're doing it very intensively. And so I loved the emphasis on flexibility and being inclusive, asking people for participation and input, and also just moving forward when you need to, according to what your commitment to contribute is. Something that I've seen in all of the groups of students. It's been really interesting, both with SDG 11 and with the various groups doing the Talanoa dialogues early. Watching, first of all, students' kind of shyness around inviting participants to give some of their time to participate in a dialogue, or our research for SDG 11's project, but then also realize that inviting especially committed experts or activists or policymakers, what have you, into these kinds of discussions, to be listened to be heard, and then having the students do some of the work of reflecting back what they've heard and how it's influenced them, what it's meant to them, is a profound process. I think the students at first feel that they might be being a little bit invasive or pesty or nuisances, and then they realize that there's a gift to offering to really listen to people and reflect back. And then the next step of that is that each group of students ended up learning something that was completely unique to them. And so they have a kind of buy-in or investment. They become stakeholders. They take ownership of what they've learned and how they can circulate that. And so one piece of the collaboration here, I think, has been helping the network circulate its own kind of knowledge about itself across these different teams. And I've loved watching students be able to take ownership of that. That's been really profound. How's that?
Perfect, Sarah H. Thank you so much. And we will transition to our second question, which we will be asking Sarah G. and, Diane and Pam. And that is, how do you think that this class will influence students going forward? And how would you prepare students for attending, and how will it prepare students for attending the COP in Glasgow next year?
I can go first. So first of all, my apologies. With the kind of last minute planning of this, my schedule got changed and I have a standing meeting on Wednesdays with my boss that I can't miss. And I told her today that I had to miss. So, but I have been less engaged with the class as a whole than I would like to be. So my apologies for that. Just this morning, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave a State of the Planet address. And what really stuck out to me is how much he emphasized the youth. And youth in the UN terms is referring to people under 25. And he made the comment about all of the financial deficits that are going to be the result of COVID is going to be put on the backs of your generation, the students in this class. And we're leaving you a really crappy planet. And I thought that was an interesting statement. And so he talked about the role of higher ed and shaping the youth voice in addressing these global issues. And it seemed like such a relevant kind of thing to think about. And he talked about higher ed having a moral obligation to make sure that we prepare the youth to have the skills, the voice, the confidence to speak up about issues, whether it's in their community or whether it's at the global stage. So in terms of this particular, this process, I think Sarah H. just mentioned this idea of hearing different voices, different expertise, different perspectives. And that is really the case when you go to the international stage. You get, I know for me, the first time I went back in 2009, and I've gone every year since, is I go in thinking as a scientist, and then I hear the different priorities depending on what country you're from and what the issues are that are all wrapped up. It's not just climate change, for instance, but social issues and financial issues and women's rights issues and so on, and realizing why it's so difficult to come to any kind of agreement. And I think that idea of you getting exposed to these different perspectives and as a group, and even the complex process of trying to organize your teams, trying to figure out, when you're going to meet, how are you going to come to consensus on what project you do. That's all part of the experiences that happen at a different level when we are at these negotiation sessions, whether it's in a COP or any of the other UN type of negotiations. So I guess those are my preliminary thoughts for that question right now.
Great, thanks, Diane. So I'll answer the first question first about how I think this class could influence students going forward. I reflected on the fact that when I took a similar type class or a bunch of classes in college, when I took environmental science classes as a student, they tended to be really negative. This is how the world is coming to an end. This is what you've done to wreck the planet. And I remember feeling just utterly in despair that there was nothing we can do. Corporations were bad. The world was bad. Governments didn't care. Adults didn't care. And I think that one thing I like about the SDG framework more than anything is it's all about action and goals and positive constructive change. So my hope is that all the students feel empowered going forward, that there are people, whether it's your future career path, whether it's your role right now, as Diane brought up with the youth, that you have a voice and you get to act on that voice, and you yourself can make a difference, and you have the world at your oyster. The world is your oyster, I suppose. I always get that wrong. That you have so many options in front of you, whether it's to work for an NGO, a government, private sector organization, and you can make a difference, right? And I think hopefully seeing the United Nations framework here, that this is international and there are so many people on board with this, that I hope you don't leave this feeling depressed, but rather feel empowered. That's really what I hope. And for going to the meeting next year, hopefully it's in person, we'll see, is kind of what Diane just said, is just to keep an open mind, is that it's I've only been to one UN COP meeting, and I also was blown away by just the number of people there from so many different backgrounds, let alone countries and ethnicity and race, but also just different professional backgrounds and how open people are to discussing different topics. And again, a very solution-oriented community of people. They're not there to complain. They're there to say, what are we going to do to make the world a better place? So my hope is that the students here feel that way and feel empowered to do something both now and in the future. Thanks.
Thank you both. Your answers really spoke to me because I do think that a lot of our curriculum can get down and be a bit more negative, but this group, for me personally, I can't speak for everyone, has done exactly that. So thank you all. And then we'll also transition to question number 3, which we'll ask to Sarah G. and Gillian. And that question is, what's our biggest learning curve this year in the YA network, and what lessons can we take forward to subsequent years? And Sarah G., why don't we have you start?
Okay, I can start. Not having given a lot of thought, and like Andrew and a few others to this. So this has been super fun for me. I launched into this just not knowing what to expect, and it's been really fun to see it happen. And it's been a little bit like surfing, I think, where things are coming together and people are doing things, and suddenly a conference occurs that I didn't have much to do with organizing other than saying, yeah, it's a good idea. So it's been fun and exhilarating to sort of put the trust in the group to get things happening. So I don't know if learning curve implies negativeness, but I didn't have very much negativeness other than myself feeling quite disorganized. I think for me, the biggest challenge that is, as the students in my class will know, is trying to mesh what I want to do in my old existing class into this new framework. And that's been difficult. But some other things that I've learned is that having the fellows is a terrific. Another place where we've had, I think, at least from the outside, it looks like the fellows are bonding with each other. They're certainly doing a tremendous amount of help to keep this process going. And I certainly hope that some existing students will grow into be fellows for next year, and that our fellows network will keep active and join us at COP in future years. What else is in that question here? What lessons can we take forward? Well, there's a lot to do, but we're learning a lot as we go. So keeping good records of all those things. And I know Diane has been busy with the assessment part and helping us sort of digest all this data. So that's an important thing that we'll have to learn how to do. Gillian, I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks, Sarah G. I think this is actually a very appropriate slide. It was me and Pam from last year. I think one of the biggest lessons we learned, or the biggest learning curve, was time zones. I mean, how to keep all the time zones straight. So I think in one of our meetings, we had 8 or 9 different time zones. So the time zone became sort of a big issue. Sort of one sort of fun chuckle for all the students is that we forgot that Australia's on the other side of the date line. So we had a while that we were planning the same conference on 2 different days, so we tried to straighten out the time zone issues. But I think the fun part is, and sort of to ask in answering question that Emily asked, is that I am so enthusiastic about this group and how this would inform future sustainable action. The Secretary General talked about youth as agents of change. And I think we saw that in Black Lives Matters. We saw that in some of the world voting records, not just in the US, but all over, of youth being more engaged in voting. So I think that's, to me, is both enthusiastic, optimistic, and the big learning curve is, okay, how do we work with global youth and get everybody to work together to make the changes that need to be changed? And of course, one of those big challenges is the time zones and trying to figure out the time zones. But the last thing I would say is just, thinking about what lessons we take to future years is, the importance of trying to work multicultural spaces when we only get to meet each other virtually. How do we make those teams, become more viable, even if we only get to meet each other virtually and may not get a chance to meet in person for all the students, and to make those teams be impactful so that when we come to another global conference like this, that we have a huge impact on our peers worldwide.
Thank you, Gillian. And we are going to make a quick pivot and ask question 6 to both Pam and Sarah H, because we do have one of our PIs that has to leave a bit early. So Pam, I'm going to start with you for question 6, which is, which of the Wednesday Yeah talks surprised you? And did any of the talks make you consider the SDGs in a different way or affect your understanding of climate change?
Great question. I think one talk that stood out for me was the potato talk. The woman who worked for the potato company, who's, if I remember correctly, they're the largest supplier to McDonald's. Is that right, for their French fries?
And yeah.
Good. And I thought that was so interesting, just because obviously you hear about a lot of big companies like McDonald's trying to do good, but a lot of times it's greenwashing. And so it was interesting, I thought, to hear concrete steps that they're taking. I also really enjoyed the State Department talk that was more recent. That was really good. That Melissa Morales asked questions of. I thought that was super interesting. All the ones that I saw, I didn't get to see every single one, but the ones I saw were just fantastic. So Diane, you want to take it now?
Was it me or somebody else?
Sorry.
I believe it's Sarah H. No
Yeah.
problem. I know that was a bit confusing.
No problem. Well, this is a hard question because there were so many great talks, but I'm just going to mention one thing that was actually something that was very new to me from Myra Jackson, who's been my primary collaborator in a lot of this work. But I had invited her to be one of our guest speakers because she was part of devising the 3-year work group, I think it was, that created the SDGs in the first place. And so I loved that she shared with us that there was a secret SDG 0, that was love and joy. And she said, and now you're on the inside, as if we'd all just crossed a kind of threshold. And that was very early in the semester. So that was a meaningful moment to me. And I think this relates in many ways to some of what Pam was referring to earlier in terms of our affective, our emotional dispositions in the face of these daunting and harrowing challenges in front of all of us in terms of stewardship of the planet. And when Myra Jackson talks about things like making sure that the planet has its say, and bringing the planet into the room, and then the affective parts of doing this work with love and joy for the interdependent web of life of which we are part. To me, as an anthropologist, that's a very important bridge to what many indigenous peoples have been sharing with us all along, and what is becoming more and more important in academic thought. Many of us, for myself, I would say, you're trained to that revealing your emotional investment in this work is a liability. It will undercut your credibility, disrupt your objectivity, as if there were such a thing. And I have become very interested in how we introduce that sort of re-enchantment of the world and invite in our affection for this work as we do this, and that this is also an important portal and bridge to incorporating all kinds of indigenous knowledge into that. In anthropologists, we talk about the world as animistic or alive, right? And that's often been, in a condescending way, been something that's been sort of relegated to folk knowledge or folk models. But in fact, I think it's becoming a more and more present and important part of this work. And so I was delighted to hear that come in, and surprised too. Thanks.
Thank you both. And I do want to open it up to 1 or 2 PIs that would also like to answer Emily's question. And just to remind you of what that was, are you more enthusiastic/optimistic about the prospect of sustainable action from governments or businesses in the near future? And how will this play into the UN talks? And if 1 or 2 would feel compelled to answer, that would be great.
I'll chip in here if you like. It's quite strange for a Brit to be talking about American politics, although you wouldn't believe how much American politics we see on our TVs and hear on our radio. But speaking from outside of the US, I think 99.9% of Europe is actually rather pleased about the recent American election. And, you know, we in Europe, we are actually quite reliant on American leadership and values to take things forwards. I think replacing somebody who at least recognizes climate change into the White House is a huge step forward, as opposed to somebody who clearly does not. And for me, that is a huge, huge positive. I don't get to vote, but boy, you know, whoever is in that White House influences what goes on in my life, because it influences the entire world. And I apologize if that's not your take on politics, but if I could just report from the, you know, from sticks out here, that I think is very much a positive for us. You know, if we can get global political leadership to take climate change seriously, you know, to come back to the Paris Agreement, to, you know, in the same way that, you know, all these students have come together and have worked on SDGs, we can get politicians to come together and work on solving the world's problems. For me, that is a genuine win. So not wishing to offend anybody, but, you know, I'm kind of just speaking the truth of what most people here feel.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. And you definitely spoke the truth, and I appreciate that. And so we will transition next to, I believe, question 5, which will be Dr. Mark Urban. And how does your work with YA, including this course, influence your broader work agenda going forward?
Did we skip question 4?
Yeah, Ali, I think we wanted Mark to answer the question.
That was
what is
definitely my
crystal
fault.
ball?
Sorry, Mark, let me read that one again to you. Apologies. What does your 2021 crystal ball best guess predict for COP26 in Glasgow next year? And if it's alive and in person, do you anticipate taking students?
Yeah, thank you. So that was the question I prepared for. So, I think if we look forward to next November, I think there's almost has to be a COP. I think that, you know, the time in which we've lost has been incredible, because we just have such little time right now to address the climate crisis. And so, you know, building off what Andrew said, you know, there's a great bit of enthusiasm now going forward, and with the U.S. Coming back in, and, you know, the loss of momentum, I think we can regain that. And so I think, you know, regardless of, you know, the pandemic, I think there has to be a COP26 happening soon, just to get us back on the right trajectory. And you know, it's clear that the worldwide enthusiasm and predictions have actually completely changed after the U.S. election. And so I think that you know, the trajectory of addressing climate change was looking pretty bad, but now that we already are seeing some, at least, suggestions that the U.S. will start to carry its burden, the projections for, you know, staying at least within 2 degrees Celsius might be possible. So I think it's going to happen, you know, in some way. Whether, you know, if things are still bad, then it will be virtual. But I think it will be in person. Actually, I think that people will be required to have proof of the vaccination to go, and I think it's going to be a big celebration. I think it's going to be a celebration not only of the U.S. being back in, but of the pandemic being over. And you know, we're going to tackle this once and for all. You know, I've been through. I started going to COP in Paris, which was wonderful, and there was this big agreement, and everyone was celebrating and drinking champagne in the streets. And then, you know, I went through 4 years of COPs where things got steadily worse, and people didn't give up, but it was certainly sort of just treading water for a while there. And so I think that the next COP will be really important for a variety of reasons, for the US being in, for the end of the pandemic, and for the fact that we need to reassess the contributions of individual countries. Yeah, whatever happens, we're going to try to take students. I mean, it's not ultimately up to me; it's up to our university. But you know, other things have happened at COPS, and we've managed to still go. So we're going to try to power through and bring students, because that's what, you know, our group tries to do, is get students to the COP, you know, interacting with world leaders and, you know, influencing world leaders as well.
Thank you so much for that answer, Mark. And we do have Elise on the call who prepared all these questions and did a primary majority of the labor. So I'm going to pass it off to her, and then we will proceed with the questions.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for bearing with the transition. My name is Elise Goen. I'm from Scripps Institution of Oceanography as a grad student, and I've been a fellow for SDG 11. So I'm going to continue on with question 5. Thank you so much, Allie, for doing a great job. So question 5 will be for Professor Diane Husick. And question 5 is, how does your work with YA, including this course, influence your broader work agenda going forward?
Thanks, Elise. You know, this is a really interesting question in so many ways. I think one of the immediate things I need to start working on is how to better incorporate the SDGs into not only our course, which has been focused on climate negotiations, but across our curriculum. And we've been having some conversations about that. But I think, you know, the lessons that we're trying to give to students about being confident, about stepping out of your comfort zone, applies to us too. And one of the interesting parallels this semester is the city that our campus is in has been going through a climate action planning process. And about 2 weeks ago, they asked me, I've been the rep from the college to the working group, to ask the college to sign on to the plan. Now, I don't think Melissa's with us today, but Moravian has been a little bit hesitant. and one of the things we keep hearing is that the president said, well, this isn't my passion. And I keep telling him, well, it doesn't matter if it's your passion or not. This is important as a moral obligation, and it's important to our students. And so I had to figure out how to take that attitude and ask the President's Council to sign on to something that I knew that they weren't passionate about. And I talked to my class, and they gave me all kinds of ideas and a pep talk and so on. And so I prepared a brief, if you will, and a little bit of thinking about negotiating skills, and brought it to the council on Tuesday. And it was amazing that unanimously they voted to support it and put their name on the city council. And I almost fell over in shock. But I think what it shows you is that sometimes and what I did is I talked about our students in this class. I talked about our students being part of this grant that involves students from around the world, and how, you know, if we can't model on our campus what we want the world to do, then we're not doing a very good job in higher ed. And I was really pleased with that result. And I think, so that gives me some more confidence that we can do things at a bigger level. And it definitely was leveraging the students' voice that allowed it to happen, I think so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to the next question. And this question will be for Professor Andrew Ramsey. And my question for you is, are you seeing issues in your community, workplaces, or others that relate to the various SDG goals? And if so, which ones and how?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, yes, I mean, I think if you know anything about the SDGs, you see issues around the SDGs in everyday life, you know. I'll pick out two. I think in terms of SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, you know, we live in a world of limited and scarce resources, and we have to use those in a sensible way that meets human need, but also meets the need of the rest of biodiversity. You know, I think we have to use that as wisely as we possibly can. We're going into approaching Christmas, a time of high levels of consumption and things like that, and the little things that we do now. I think if we could all just try to live a little bit simpler, and perhaps not overuse the world's resources and not overconsume, and within our lives make as little impact as we can on the planet. I think that would be a very popular thing. And I think we've certainly seen that in a lot of the discussions about COVID, particularly earlier on, where we had we had dolphins coming back into Venice, where we had biodiversity coming back into urban environments because they were quieter. I think we'd probably the whole world would do better if we just tried to consume a little bit less and consume responsibly. I would encourage us all to do that, even though we can't always live what we would like to in the way that we would like to do. We tend to complicate things a little bit. The second one is kind of locally for me, I suppose, which is about life on land. My home is an area of really intense sheep farming. I mean, you can barely walk out the door without tripping over a sheep around here. People in the UK, sheep farmers don't make any money out of sheep. They actually make a loss on every single sheep. They're only allowed to, they can only continue because they get subsidies for the sheep, and that keeps them sheep farming. As Brexit is kind of appearing at the end of this year, those subsidies are going to stop. So the problem with our sheep is that they destroy biodiversity. Basically, they kind of mow all the vegetation down to almost like a lawn. You don't believe it. Looks very pretty, but there's almost zero biodiversity. So I think we are going to see, for me, I'm going to see huge changes locally over the next sort of 8 to 10 years about the way that the land is managed. And I'm hoping that shift will go away from producing things that nobody wants to helping to meet some of those SDGs. Because if we can farm in a more carbon friendly and more biodiverse way, that still allows people to make an income, still keeps the communities around here together, that will be a very positive thing. And I'm genuinely hoping that as we consider the way that we manage our land and manage our ecosystems, I'm really hoping that we can end up with much better systems, that are not just the traditional ways that we've done things, which is what sheep farming is around here. It's highly traditional, to something that is perhaps a little bit more future focused and meets the needs of all life on this planet, and not just a few humans. So that's an example of life on land that's happening outside my front door now. And I'm sure from the different parts of the world that we are in, we can all relate to the way that we do things and how we might be able to, with a little bit of common sense, a little bit of nous and forward thinking, do things a bit better.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, perfect. Wonderful answer. And I really like how you connected it to something that's in your hometown that I don't see quite often in San Diego, California.
Okay.
And I do.
If you'd like some sheep, we've got plenty.
Oh, yes, please. And I do want to remind students and fellows, if you would like to ask questions here and there as follow-ups, please feel free to in the chat. But for now, I will move on to my next question. This next question will be for Professor Sarah Green. My question for you is, many of us would be in Glasgow at COP26 if not for the pandemic. How does the postponement to 21 affect and perhaps create opportunities for YA, including plans to bring students or classes to Glasgow?
Phew. Well, it was both a plus and a negative that we didn't get to go to Glasgow this year because so many people really would have liked to go. On the budget side, it does give us a little bit more leeway. On the planning side, it gives us a lot more time to find that castle that Andrew is promising us, the Airbnb where we're all going to stay in Glasgow. And I think for this year, it did make it frenetic as it seemed for the class. It was less frenetic than it would have been if we had spent a lot of time trying to wrangle everybody. The process even for getting students registered and the limited number of slots is really complicated for going to these UN meetings, and it takes a huge amount of time, which we did not have to spend this year. So there are pluses and minuses. One thing that I'm happy about is establishing this network means that we'll have a collection of alumni and fellows who will be able to help, I hope, and come to some of these meetings in the future. If not next year, then in future years, you're signed up for this network forever. We're going to track you down with your emails. For people who were disappointed not to be able to go this year, hopefully there will be a chance in the future. And the climate talks, the climate negotiations are not the only international meeting. There are others. There's biodiversity, there's UNEA, all of which in some way or another allow observer organizations to participate. So I'm hoping that we can eventually expand beyond the climate talks and attend some of these other high-level meetings as well. So give students the opportunity to go there. I'll echo just a few comments from earlier about the conference that we're having next week and the preparations for it, and the student interactions and collaborations have worked beyond what I expected really, really well. Well, we'll see about the conference, but it sure looks good at this point. And I think that experience will be really valuable for whatever career you follow, and will be helpful to try to understand what's going on at these higher level meetings, even if you only attend them virtually. Plus, we are all around as the network to help interpret what's going on as well. There are some people in this group who have been to many COPs and have followed these issues, year by year all the way through. And I'm sure that they're all going to be available for questions when you do get a chance to engage. So on to who is next, I forgot.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to ask the same question to Professor Mark Urban as well. So I'm going to repeat the question really quick for you if you forgot. But how does the postponement to 21 for COP26 affect and perhaps create opportunities for YA, including plans to bring students to Glasgow?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's similar to what Sarah suggested. So some negatives, particularly because we end up usually taking seniors, and so we sort of lost that group of environmental leaders. So UConn, we just, you didn't have a class this year because it's so heavily associated with going to the COP, and so we really did lose out on that group of senior students that would have benefited from these interactions. But it does allow us to devote more resources to thinking about the next one, and and frankly, it just wouldn't have been possible anyway because of the other restrictions and financial problems that are going on with because of the pandemic. It would have been really tough to raise the money to do what we did before. But we also did lose some momentum, I think, because for us, we started kind of small, and the first time we went, we didn't have any passes, and then we got some passes, and then sort of built up to the point where we were bringing a large group of students, and they all had passes, at least for some days, to the conference, and hopefully we don't lose that momentum, and we can regain that going forward. But yeah, I mean, certainly it's a bit of a downer, but we're looking to the future and looking to be back bigger and better than before.
Wonderful, thank you. And I do have another question here, and this one is for Gillian this time. So my question for you, each year's process for YA teams differs. This year, cross-campus and international teams first organized around 1 or 2 SDGs and then found case studies around that. What strengths and or opportunities does this create? And if you can include some challenges as well.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting question, in part because one of the things that we've been doing on the side is actually trying to figure out a new way to create the teams. So I'll shortly answer what I think we could have done better this year, but also talk about some of our vision, because I think it's really exciting about what we're exploring. So in the first year, so this is actually the second year of this class, actually technically it's the third year of this class that has been done jointly, starting with Katowice when we first had several universities work together. And the teams became a way to get the students to introduce themselves to each other across universities before we got to the COP itself. And they chose topics within the universities themselves. So last year, for example, was mostly case studies based on what was going on within the university. So segue forward, and I think what I found particularly interesting this year was the incredible variety of topics that the teams ended up focusing on, given the SDGs that they chose, but also the opportunity to broaden that reach from just taking what an individual campus is doing to really where the students' interests are, whether it's police brutality, tying to what's going on, within the U.S. soil right now, or some of these broader issues. So one of our crazy harebrained ideas that we hope we can pull off in the next couple of months, if we can figure out how to do this, is to do a better job of providing a larger palette of issues to look at across the world, taking full advantage of our virtual environment, full advantage of networking opportunities, so that the next year teams of students can choose, countries and issues associated with the SDGs, where those topics are the hottest and where their interests are. And I think that helps with the team formation and stability. If everybody's really excited about an issue, that helps the team move forward a lot faster. But unlike with Marcus, I'm really hopeful that we've learned this year, how to build these teams so that next year, as Glasgow comes up very quickly for next year, it will come up in early November. And assuming that we do get to go, whether we get to go inside the doors or we just get to be nearby was still a question, but that we can pull these teams together and get them close to the negotiating platforms to get them to experience that negotiation and the cultures around the negotiation, because that's such an important part. I can't emphasize that enough. And Diane and others have mentioned that going to the COP and getting immersed in the culture of 192 nations is really quite the experience. And I think that's part of our goals. But also going to the COP and working with other institutions like Susie from Monash and others to ask the same questions is also quite the amazing experience. So hopefully next year, we'll be able to provide both of those experiences, whether it becomes in a virtual conference nearby to Glasgow, virtual conference at home, or at the COP itself.
Great, thank you so much for answering that question for us. So I do want to open up the floor to anyone who might have burning questions for anybody on the call. So fellows, students, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to type it into the chat, I can ask for you. But while we're waiting on that, I have a question just to anyone who would like to respond, any of our PIs on the call today. Do you have any advice on moving forward past this class?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump back in. My colleague get their thoughts together. The number one advice I think from this class is that the entire world went virtual this year. And, you know, right now the climate dialogues, as Diane's pointed out, are going on. But the key thing that's going on is that you can actually now log in to any of the negotiation sessions. So it's no longer controlled by tickets. It's no longer controlled by rooms that didn't have any Wi-Fi in them. I think the UN has really adjusted very quickly to the virtual environment. And I think that's going to be the wave of the future. So don't let the format dissuade you. If you're interested in international conversations, that there are many ways to participate, and I would certainly urge you all to do that. There are a bunch of international conferences that go on that can make you feel part and make you feel a part of the solutions for the climate challenges worldwide. And I think that's the last thing just to think about a little bit is the UN Secretary General last week talked about youth as the agents of change. So I think if we don't participate in these climate conferences, the risk is that the youth are disconnected from what goes on in climate negotiations. And we need to stay connected, and we need to hold everybody's feet to the fire so that by 2030, when Sustainable Development Goals mature, that we achieve the goals as we envision them.
I think one of the things, a piece of advice that I would give is how important networks are. So you've had a variety of speakers this year or this semester. Don't be afraid to reach out, and even if it's a thank you, thanks for what I learned from you. And but don't forget these people. Think about it as your virtual Rolodex. So much of, I think Gillian can attest to this as well, that how we've gotten to where we are is based on people we met, networks, collaborations, partnerships. And it's really, really an important part of what makes successful projects, whether it's just your own personal career or whether it's the alliances you need to really make change in the world.
Thank you both for your comments. Those were really insightful, especially in our new virtual world. I do have a question from Sarah W. This question is for anyone to answer, so whoever feels the most inclined, please speak up. But the question is, each team completed an SDG project this semester as part of their teams. How can this work translate to future higher education efforts, research, and community action? And I don't mind picking on someone. So how about Professor Andrew Ramsey? How will this work translate to your future efforts?
Oh, thank you so much for dropping me on that one. Okay. Very much. I've taught conservation biology for a very, very, very long time, and I've taught it in a very traditional way. But the experiences that I've had, every time I've had an experience, I've usually changed the approach to how I've done things. This year, the second assessment that I've set for my students is actually around conservation biology and the SDGs, and how you can combine working to deliver the SDGs with working to deliver conservation biology. So for me, suddenly, I'm incorporating the SDGs far more into the work that I'm doing, into the teaching that I'm doing, into the modules that we're developing within courses. And the SDGs have stopped being peripheral to that and have started to become central to that. And in truth, that is not the influence of me being bright and reading about the SDGs. That is the influence of the people who are on this call as much as anything else, because you talk to your colleagues and you talk to your networks and you talk to your friends, and you realize what you can do better. So very much this work will feed back, because I won't go I won't go backwards on this. You know, I'll be taking this forward into my teaching, and I actually do think that, you know, one of the problems of conservation biology is that people go, well, so what? Why should you save this ecosystem, this species, this community of animals and plants? And in actual fact, the SDGs very often give you a reason, because the services that those ecosystems provide underpin a huge proportion of what the SDGs are. So that's what I'm taking back into my teaching, and hopefully into my research too. And I should probably do a lot more community action than I actually do. But I'd also like to see the urban ecosystems I'm associated with be a bit more sustainable, and I think biodiversity is a big part of that. So that's what I'm going to take back.
Thank you for responding. Thank you so much. I do have another question in the chat, and this is from Andres Sweetland. And I'm going to call on Professor Sarah Hautzinger, since I haven't heard from you since I joined the call. So my question for you, how do you stay passionate or positive as a voice of climate or social action, given administration or circumstances pushing against you? Basically, how do you lobby for something which might be pushed against?
Okay. Thanks, Andres. That's a great question. I'm thinking of the city that I live in, Colorado Springs, which has been called the most military city in the United States. It's surrounded by 5 military bases. It's a bastion of the religious right and the reddest spot in a pretty blue state, or for the non-Americans, which is to say a very Republican and conservative area. And what we have done here is what good anthropologist training does is instead of thinking about it in terms of opposition, you try to step into other people's shoes, and especially other people's language and their priorities and their interests. And so what we've seen here is climate activists, and in particularly working on closing a dirty coal burning plant right downtown, appeal to a lot of conservatives' sense of the economy and how and basically lay out the evidence as to why in the short, medium, and certainly the long term, this was actually going to lead to more economic growth, attracting more businesses and the like. I think of it also in terms of the Talanoa dialogues, and the first round that we did of this was connected to something that came out of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truths films, and it was a side project called Inconvenient Sabbath, and it was trying to think about different faith traditions and how, you know, say this notion, say that conservative evangelicals are constitutionally opposed to climate action. And this project worked a lot on listening to the language of each of these religious or spiritual traditions. And so in the case of, say, evangelical Christians, really talking in terms of stewardship and the role of humanity in caretaking of the planet. And this is one of the things that was part of building bridges to the creation care movement and the like. So that's been something that's really inspiring me, is that if one can actually step away from sort of having one's heels dug into one's own positionality always, and step over to someone else and then find the commonalities through language, frameworks, viewpoints, worldviews, practices, priorities, all of those things. And that's what I think that this network is so rich in the kinds of affiliations we're seeing in our SDG teams with students across different campuses and the fellows and the like, as others have commented. So all of that keeps my torch alive in what, can be blustery weather, to say the very least. So it's a great question. I'm sure others would have a lot to add to that too, if people want to.
others do have things to add. Go ahead, Professor Cusick.
Sarah, that was fantastic. And Andres, this is a great question. And first to the part about why do I stay passionate and positive? I have two sons. One's in graduate school and one's a senior in college, and so roughly your age. And thinking about their future and the responsibility that I owe them is worth keeping me going in this area. The second thing that keeps me passionate, and I've been really fortunate to work at one of the most contaminated sites in the country, and this sounds really strange, but it was a Superfund site. It's the largest one east of the Mississippi River. And I watched it go through, it was a totally denuded, no vegetation, no life at all, to now it's a wildlife refuge open to the public. And this was done not by restoration experts, but by community members who cared about their backyard. And Gillian had the pleasure of walking through it with me this summer. And it is one of the best stories of hope. When I was your age, this was an example in the environmental science textbooks of total failure of what we've done to the planet. And now it's the opposite. It's the example of what can be done if people put their minds to it and kind of help nature recover. So focusing on positive, seeing the media tends to cover the negative, and there's so many good stories that there don't get shared in terms of what's happening. But I want to pick up on something Sarah mentioned, and that is, how do you find ways to have communication with people that may seem to have very different perspectives than you? And so Pennsylvania is a coal state historically. Oil was discovered here, and now it's a fracking state. So talking about climate change and moving away from fossil fuels is not an easy topic. I'm surrounded by Trump signs still. And I have been asked to talk to people about climate change, and that's an interesting task. And one of the things I've done is taken away the terminology and find ways to have people think about what's changing in their lives and what's important to them. So that could be somebody's garden. That could be a farmer who's noticing differences in their crops. That could be, and believe it or not, trout fishermen who are very concerned about the warming streams. And they'll tell you all of these signs of climate change without using the phrase. And they're very worried about these things. And so we start conversations on kind of at their place, like where they are, and think about what can we do about it, like what matters to them. And it's amazing where you can get with those conversations if you really come down and as Sarah said, listen and put aside your own views and your own perspectives for a little while and just hear what the concerns of people are.
Thank you very much. And I'll also ask Professor Green to comment on the same question.
Hi, I guess a lot of us have things to say about this, people who have been in the trenches and not. And I have a couple things. I did put a quote from FDR in the chat there, which really struck me. Someone quoted this to me at the beginning of the pandemic, which is, to some generations, much is given, of other generations, much is expected. And this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. And I think he was talking obviously about a different time, but really a time of big change. And it's kind of scary to live through those, but it can be really exhilarating, and it can give you a chance to really change the path of history. So, but just a couple of things also that struck me. People sometimes feel like, oh, I'm not doing anything if I'm not at the negotiating table at COP, or if I'm not at some high level thing, or if I'm not visible doing this. But there's so many things and so many scales and levels of engagement that you can have, all of which are important. I think, I don't know why I have this analogy in my head, but about smoking. So if you're worried about people killing themselves by smoking, you can work on all sorts of different levels. You can work, as a doctor, you can work as a nurse, you can work helping individual people with individual problems, or you can work at a research lab, or you can work on a policy, trying to change policy so people don't smoke. You can work on trying to change corporate responsibility. You can do all sorts of levels of action, and none of them is more or less important. They're just different ways of going at a problem. And climate is also a huge problem, but there's so many spaces that you can poke it to make progress. And the other thing is that we look back at history and we see progress sort of on a continual path, linear up or down or something, but actually it goes in fits and starts. And a lot of things are sort of a buildup, like you're preparing for a window of opportunity, and then suddenly you can act on it. And I saw this personally when I was at the State Department on wildlife trafficking. There were people in all sorts of agencies all across the government who had been worried about wildlife trafficking and how are we going to address it, and what do we do with customs, what do we do with, what does the Forest Service do, how do we deal with this? And then President Obama signed an executive order saying we must do something about wildlife trafficking. And all of this work that had been in preparation for years and years and years, I knew nothing about, suddenly popped up. An interagency group was formed and people started working together with all of these, all this preparation that they had made. So sometimes just, it doesn't feel like you're going anywhere, but you are. And then the other thing that helps me on this is to step back and do some long-term thinking and think. I live right here on Lake Superior, out the window here, and you know, seasonally and annually the lake level goes up and down and up and down. But I look and I see these rocks that have been here for 1 billion years, some of them. And so, and I look at the forests that have changed in 100 years from being completely denuded to big forests again. And like Diane, I can see that we live in a very small sliver of time, and we could just make a difference where we are at this time. All right, enough from me.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for that wonderful question. I love the participation in this this room. I do have a final question for Professor Gillian, and I'm going to leave it at that because we do have a couple of reminders for next week. So my final question for Gillian would be, how do we stay involved with this program and with this group?
Thanks for that question. First, I want to say thank you to all the other PIs for participating and joining the call and, you know, sharing their views. And what we hope to do with this sort of panel was to share, you know, from our perspective, why did we come here? Why is this so important? And I think the timing now is even more important than ever. I wish I had a video. We sat during the Paris Agreement, while the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, in a place called Le Petit Palais, that hosted a meeting with John Kerry about where do we need to go, what do we need to do, and how do we need to get there. And those questions actually popped up again much later on as part of the Dialoga dialogues. But to see someone like John Kerry now be part of the administration to continue to ask those questions, you know, where are we now, where do we need to go, and how are we all going to get there, is just so important, and important to taking forward for this class. So I wanted to do a quick closeout to the class, you know, along with thanking all my colleagues for, you know, going through this journey together, for putting up with our meeting in Madrid last minute, late night, while we actually sat down and put this proposal together. This is kind of amazing when you think about it. To all the students for participating in this class. This is our pilot year of the class, and we are looking forward to going for 5 more years. It's a 5-year grant. So to answer the question about how do you get involved, and it should be beyond the class. Our goal as the project was twofold. Number one was to open the doors so you could see how international negotiations work. You know, I work on mostly things with 6 legs, so pollinators and other things. But, you know, organisms don't see international boundaries. And that simple fact we tend to not pay enough attention to when we think about, and I'm going to beat up on Andrew, on conservation and other issues, that there's not an organism out there that can think about a boundary and understand where those boundaries are. And pollution and climate change doesn't see boundaries. But we still want to try and teach these sciences without addressing that issue. What happens when that organism crosses a boundary? All your conservation best practices can go out the window when you switch cultures to a different country. So that was one of our goals, just to give everybody that sense of understanding that conservation does have a cultural context. It shifts when you go from one country to another. There is no good or bad, as Sarah said, it's just different when we go from one country. And the glory is to look at that, just amazing diversity of humankind on this planet. And then we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to protect this planet for our future generations. So how do we do that? We have to work together. We have to work across these international boundaries. The second was sort of, how does that work take place? And institutions tend to have their own cultures that we also don't pay enough attention to. How we teach within our institutions is an important part. So creating these multi-institutional teams is a really important part of our goal. So everybody could get a sense of what is a different institution doing, how do we work across those institutions, and how do we get there? So just in closing, just to remind everybody that there were a couple things we need to do. One is that this conference next week is really exciting. We have 200 close to participants from all over the world, from New Zealand, Japan, couple countries in South America, Brazil. I mean, it's just all over the place. And that is so exciting. And these are people who are volunteering their time. These are all students from different institutions to come together. The conference has been put together in main part by colleagues from different countries. Andrew is the lead of our conference organizing team. Monash University in Australia really put, their Australian touch in, and we got to argue about versus dragon wrangling. We got to argue about potatoes in several different, whether they're tater tots or whether they're mashed or whether they're with smashed peas or something like that. And that's sort of the fun of working internationally, is that all these different languages and food groups and who likes what and who's got the best fish and chips and who has the best pizza become part of creating that team that can work together and try and ask a bigger question. So I do want to make sure I give a second or a moment before we all leave and go into our conference next year, just to remind all the students that we really appreciate your time and your effort in working outside of a classroom setting and working on Slack and doing things. We so look forward to your presentations next week. I'm really excited to hear about what you've discovered over the week working together across things, and a special shout out to the Yay Fellows for being our fearless leaders to try and get these teams up together and off the ground. So with that, being mindful of our time, we can ask Sarah to stop sharing her screen, and maybe we can all turn our videos on and give a quick wave, and we all look forward to getting together next week and sharing. And we want to make sure everybody realizes that next semester, spring semester, this project is still going strong. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to have you participate more. If you're interested, just shoot us a message. There'll be a team of about 8 students working next semester. So we invite more participants as we get forward to Glasgow. I do hear from Andrew that the dragon that he has managed to get for us is quite large, so we probably need a whole pile of students to control this dragon. And we do hope to be able to invite students to actually participate at Glasgow. I mean, as most of you heard, we have funding, and we sat on that funding this year so that we can invite everybody to participate next year. But I think you do have to get a certificate in dragon handling from Andrew before you're allowed to go to Glasgow, or something along those lines. But anyway, just to make sure we give it a great thanks, and we will see you all next week in the conference with our amazing speakers. And thanks again for an incredible semester. It was exciting. And so we'll see you all soon.
Thanks to all the fellows.
Thank you, fellows.